Viridian, the Green Guide, by Clouds. My Head in the Clouds Not Coming Down. Read by Oakshadow 5. Chapter 12. Analysis. Summary. Izuku runs into Eraserhead again a little sooner than he'd hoped. Izuku hesitated before grabbing a marble out of the pouch on his belt. Why couldn't Amplifier be closer, or even Rocklog? He could have dealt with that. But why did it have to be Eraserhead? Izuku instinctively looked back, even though the mugging he'd come across was a few streets away. Maybe he'd be able to handle it on his own. He could just go back, but there were 5 big guys and the victim didn't look like he'd be able to run away fast enough if Izuku were to die, which was likely, considering he was still injured from his fight last night. Izuku groaned in frustration, then threw the marble, which bounced off Eraserhead's back. Izuku's jaw dropped at his reflexes as Eraser whipped around and immediately grabbed the marble out of the air before it could hit the ground. He looked at it for a second in confusion before looking around. Izuku winced as he saw the ugly bruise spreading across Eraser's nose. He was such a bad person. He froze as Eraser's eyes zeroed in on him, but his expression was strange. Eraser should be really angry, and Izuku had been expecting a scowl like Hachan had when Izuku annoyed him, but instead Eraser looked relieved? It must just be because Izuku couldn't see his eyes, or he was just be terrible at reading facial expressions, because there was no way that someone would be relieved to see the person who punched them in the nose. Eraser must just be hiding his anger. Izuku smiled apologetically and started running. This was so embarrassing. Eraser probably wanted nothing to do with him, and yet he was asking for help from someone who he'd hurt. He didn't deserve Eraser's help. He'd just have to stick around and help with the fight, so Eraser didn't have to work as hard. He couldn't just punch him in the face and expect him to do all the work. When they reached the mugging, Izuku ran right in, Eraserhead close behind him. The thugs were big, and at least 2 of them seemed to have minor strength enhancement quirks, so Izuku should try to handle the others first. He rushed toward a skinny guy who was manifesting short blades from his skin. He would probably get cut a few times, but it was better he got hurt than Eraserhead. He probably deserved some extra pain after what he'd done. Suddenly, the blades disappeared, and Izuku glanced behind him to see Eraser glaring at his villain. Viridian, you have a slingshot for a reason. Don't just run in recklessly. Izuku's eyes widened. He was right. He'd brought his slingshot so he didn't have to get close to villains if he didn't have to. And Eraserhead had to cancel the knife villain's quirk to remind him of that, which meant that he wasn't able to worry about the others, which meant that Izuku had messed everything up again. Nice going, Deku. He quickly got out of the knife quirk user's range and jumped on top of the dumpster, so he had a good view of the fight, then got out his slingshot and a handful of marbles. He started pelting all 5 thugs with as many marbles as he could without hitting Eraserhead. Mostly he just distracted the villains long enough for Eraserhead to get a hit in, which honestly worked pretty well. It had only been a few minutes, and Eraserhead already managed to put 2 thugs out of commission. He was so cool. Eraserhead was focused on fighting the 2 strength quirk villains, and Izuku was focused on creating an opening for Eraser, so neither of them noticed one of the thugs literally melt into the shadows and make his way to the dumpster Izuku was standing on. Izuku screamed and almost lost his balance when a creepy smile suddenly popped into existence in front of him. But before he could fall, the shadow villain grabbed his arm and flipped Izuku over his shoulder, slamming him hard onto the concrete. Izuku grit his teeth as he forced himself to roll to his feet like Eraser had taught him and grabbed his pipes. He lowered himself into a battle stance as he tried to keep his eye on the villain, but he simply melted into the shadows again, then popped up behind Izuku and kicked him in the back. This fight really wasn't good for his still bruised ribs. Izuku ran through what he knew about the guy's quirk. Okay, so he could blend in with shadows. Was he using it as a disguise to make himself invisible, or was he actually changing the shape of his body? Maybe he was using it to teleport? As the villain started to disappear again, Izuku ran forward and grabbed at the air. There! The villain was still there. He simply became invisible in darkness. Izuku grinned and closed his eyes. If he couldn't rely on his sense of sight, he'd just have to use his other senses. Kachan's explosions could get bright enough to temporarily blind someone, and he'd gone through a phase in an elementary school where his favorite pastime was to blind Izuku during recess, then have his lackeys attack him while he couldn't see. Izuku had to learn to dodge based only on sound and movement, and eventually he'd gotten good enough at it that Kachan decided the game was too boring, and he'd stopped. Izuku just hoped he wasn't too out of practice. Izuku took a deep breath. He could hear Erza fighting those other two villains a little farther away, but let that fade into the background. He only needed to worry about the sounds closest to him. There was a footstep off to his left and a slight breeze by his shoulder, so Izuku leaned right and felt the punch fly past him. Okay, he could do this. There were a few more steps, then a change in air pressure on his other side, so he dodged again. The next punch came quicker, since the villain was probably trying to be unpredictable, but Izuku ducked so that the punch only knocked his hood off rather than breaking his nose. The next punch was on his left again, but it was eerily similar to Kachan's right hook, so Izuku was ready. He grabbed the man's arm and yanked as hard as he could, imitating the way Amplifier moved her feet when she judo-flipped villains. He opened his eyes to see the guy lying dazed on the ground, so Izuku hurried to flip him over onto his stomach and zip-tie his hands behind him before he could disappear again. He'd done it! He'd taken him down! Shota was freaking out. He'd heard Viridian scream a few minutes ago, but he couldn't afford to take his eyes off the two villains he was fighting. He just had to hope the kid would be alright. Viridian had been doing this for 2 months now. He knew enough not to die. It was just a question about whether he would actually use what he knew. Damn problem child. But for right now, Shota had his own problems to worry about. These two couldn't do too much in the short time that it took to blink, but he still needed to end this quickly. He used his capture weapon to grab one and toss him into the other, but that one was steady enough that he just grunted, then threw another punch. Shota jumped into the air to dodge, and flipped to land behind the guy without ever taking his eyes off him, a trick he'd perfected in high school. He managed to kick him in the kidneys, but by that time, the first one was back on his feet and swinging for Shota's face too fast for him to dodge. Shota flinched, but before the hit could land, the villain was hit on the side of the head with a soup can and went down. Shota glanced back to see Viridian standing there with that same half-determined, half-terrified expression he'd had during their last fight together, having obviously just thrown the can. In the split second Shota watched, Viridian grabbed his slingshot, which had somehow ended up on the ground, and drew it back. Duck! Shota didn't hesitate to comply, and a second later, a marble shot over his head, and he heard the final villain swear. He turned and shot his capture weapon out in one fluid movement, catching the still swearing villain by surprise. He wrapped the weapon around the man's ankle and launched him into the wall, then grabbed him by the hair and hit his head against the wall to knock him out. When that was done, Shota looked around frantically to make sure Viridian was alright, only to find him already comforting the victim. Shota looked around the alley and took stock of the situation. In addition to a zip-tied villain that Viridian must have taken down, the floor was littered with marbles and... Was that Viridian's notebook? Shota glanced over at Viridian, who was now making sure the victim called the police. It must have fallen out the problem's child's pocket sometime during the fight. He picked the notebook up and, against his better judgment, started leafing through it. So he was curious. Sue him. There were diagrams notating different fighting styles, along with what heroes used them, and Shota smiled fondly when he realized that the kid had been trying to imitate some of his moves as well. He kept reading and was pleased to find that the kid had started focusing on villain analysis recently. He didn't recognize most of the villains Viridian had written about, so he didn't bother to read carefully. But there was one entry about a villain Amplifier arrested a week or so ago that caught his eye. She'd been complaining about how hard it was because the guy's quirk let him see through solid objects, a skill he'd been using to peek inside women's guest rooms in the bars he visited. He'd managed to hide from her for a good while, because he'd just hide behind something so she couldn't see him, but he'd always been able to see her coming. Eventually, Viridian had apparently led her to him, but the whole chase had lasted several hours. Viridian's notes were mostly stream of consciousness, and his handwriting got messier the faster he wrote, so it took a few moments for Shota to get used to the style and figure out what the note said, but when he did... Whoa! Guy seems to be an emitter type. Always runs away moments before Amplifier finds him. Like he already knows she's coming. Some type of premonition quirk? Probably not. Those are super rare and highly regulated. If something like that were a villain, the government would know and warn the public. That's what they've done before when it's happened. So other possibilities? Maybe he sees her coming? Some remote vision quirk? How did he get caught in a chase then? Limit? He doesn't seem to run until she's right around the corner. So X-ray vision? Then there must be objects he can't see through. Lead? Impractical. But if he's looking through objects, then he won't think to look up. Thinking back, Amplifier had said she was surprised because Viridian led her over the rooftops to find the peeping Tom. Had he done that specifically to counteract the man's quirk? He'd managed to figure out the villain's quirk and how to work around it just from watching what he did, without knowing anything about him beforehand. That was amazing. Shota went back and started reading some of the other analysis more carefully. If he'd thought that the peeping Tom analysis was the exception to the rule, he'd been wrong. Every analysis showed similar depth and thought, and could easily rival a professional analyst's skill, even if Viridian's weren't as polished. Shota had been assuming that Viridian had a mild speed quirk, but from what he'd read so far, analysis quirk was more likely, and a powerful one at that. This kid. Eraserhead, sir? Shota looked up to see Viridian staring at the notebook in his hands. Well, he may as well let the kid know what he thought, since he'd already been caught. These analyses are pretty impressive, kid. To his surprise, rather than accepting the praise, Viridian shook his head. No, they're not. I just write things down so I don't forget them. It's not like I'm writing anything special. Shota's eyebrows shot up. You don't think this is anything special? Kid, you'll figure out people's quirks and how to beat them within minutes. Viridian shook his head again. Anyone can do that. They're just smart enough that they don't have to write it down to remember it. I'm not smart like them. Shota frowned. From what he'd read, the kid was probably a genius, so he must be joking when he said he wasn't smart. Unless... But Viridian's self-esteem couldn't be that bad, could it? Don't kid yourself, problem child. He held up the book. I wish my students were half this smart. Viridian fidgeted for a moment before suddenly snatching the notebook out of Shota's hands and running off. Shota groaned and considered chasing after him, but some of the villains were already starting to wake up, and the police would be arriving any moment. Damn problem child. Izuku was already a few blocks away by the time he stopped to catch his breath. He'd have to be more careful with his notebook. That was so embarrassing. Eraser had to lie and call him smart just to be polite, even though he'd probably been creeped out by Izuku's stupid ramblings just like his classmates were. Because there was obviously no way he actually believed Izuku was smart, right? But Eraserhead also didn't really care about politeness and social norms, so he wouldn't lie just to be polite, so... But he also hadn't seemed as angry as Izuku expected, considering that he had a bruise from when... Dang it, Izuku muttered. I forgot to apologize. That was chapter 12 of Viridian the Green Guide. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I'm very sorry for the lack of update on last Sunday. I hope I can upload again more consistently, but my finals were yesterday for me when I'm recording this tomorrow, my one final, so I really didn't have the time for that. But I hope you guys enjoyed this one, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye!